We're happy to host today's lecture series titled Muslim American Women, Difficult Identity Work in Campus Peer Culture with Dr. Shabana Mir. Just a little bit on Dr. Mir's bio. She is an author of the award-winning book, Muslim American Women on Campus, Undergraduate Social Life and Identity, published by the University of North Carolina Press. The book has received the Outstanding Book Award from the National Association for Ethnic Studies and the Critics' Choice Award from the American Educational Studies Association. Also, Dr. Mir earned her PhD in Education Policy Studies and Anthropology with a concentration in Comparative Education from Indiana University in Bloomington. While there, she received an Outstanding Dissertation Award for her doctoral dissertation from the American Anthropological Association's Council on Anthropology and Education. In addition, she did ethnographic fieldwork in Washington, D.C. as a visiting researcher at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. She also earned her MA in English Literature from Punjab University in Pakistan, as well as a Master's in Education from Cambridge University. Also, she's an international speaker. She speaks on gender, religion, education, and politics. She speaks multiple languages, which includes English, Urdu, and Punjabi, with Arabic and Farsi as well. AIC is an honor to have her as our General Education Coordinator and Assistant Professor of Anthropology. So we would like to welcome Dr. Mir.
Thank you, that's very kind of you. Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and welcome to American Islamic College. I'm honored that you all took the time to come today. I should probably get closer to the mic. I'm honored that you took the time to come today to attend this talk. I know it's not the most fun time to be on the road, so I particularly appreciate you being here. So what I thought we could do was we could talk about a couple issues that the book raises, and then we could spend a lot more time maybe dealing with questions and answers. It's impossible to cover, well, unless I read the entire book right now, it's impossible to cover all the issues in a let's say about a 20-minute talk or so. So I'm going to try to use some of my research data to unpack some of the issues that I encountered in my research. And then I would love to get some questions after we finish.
Please take more than 20 minutes if necessary.
Really? Okay, all right. I will. Well, I'll probably do that. You know what professors are like, right? Once you get us talking, it's hard to get us to stop. So, so this is the book that we are talking about. I have been very honored by professional organizations, by my colleagues. I've received, well, I should say probably total of 3 awards so far. 2 on the book and 1 for my dissertation, on which the book is based, but which the book is not, does not match exactly. So there are differences between the book and the dissertation. First of all, let me check. Can you all hear me? Good? Okay. Awesome. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to draw upon this book, Muslim American Women on Campus, Undergraduate Social Life and Identity, to tell you some college student stories and to work on interpreting them with your assistance. And throughout this talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rely upon what researchers call raw data, which in my case is quotes from in-depth interviews with my research respondents. And I'm going to use those quotes to talk about important themes related to religious identity, related to campus culture, and related to pluralism on college campuses. Before I start, let me do a very quick survey of the audience so I know who I am addressing. Would you raise your hand if you are a parent? if you're a parent, okay? Yeah, you forgot. You're not supposed to forget that you're a parent, okay? How about any students under the age of 30? Okay. What about young people under 20? Oh, cool! I did not know that. All right. What about people who attended high school in the United States? Okay, I did not, so it's good to know. All right, so that gives me a good sense of who's here. So we'll dive right in. So my book is based on ethnographic research that I conducted at two diverse private university campuses. You're probably familiar with them, Georgetown University and George Washington University in Washington, D.C. The research was conducted not long after 9/11. I did participant observation with the Muslim student communities at these campuses, as well as more focused participant observation and in-depth interviews with 26 primary female respondents in particular. Now, I think I have at least a couple of people from my research methods class here, right? One person from my research methods class. And we've been talking about what ethnography is. So what ethnography is, it is intensive, in-depth qualitative research. And what it means is that I hung out with Muslim students on campus on an everyday basis, as well as interviewed them regularly, at least once a month, for over a year. Those interviews being in-depth and probing, focusing on issues of identity and campus culture. So when people ask me what it is I do and why I get paid the big bucks, I remind them of the time-consuming, intellectually demanding process of collecting, analyzing, writing up, and publishing data. So that was my ethnographic work, and it was conducted between 2002 and 2003, but I went for follow-up research later as well. Who were my research respondents? I've mentioned that I did research with the Muslim student communities, but I did in-depth interviews, more particularly with 26 undergraduate women, 13 from each of those two campuses that I've mentioned. All of them identified as Muslim, though they identified with varying types and levels of religiosity, however you define them. They came from a variety of different ethnic backgrounds. I've mentioned them here. What was I interested in? I was primarily interested in Muslim American youth identities on campus and how the campus environment facilitated and or inhibited their identity work. So one of my key findings was that Muslim college students often feel that their non-Muslim peers and faculty don't really get them. That's not a big surprise, right? To many of us, it's not really a huge surprise. And that they hold certain set stereotypes about them. What we often assume is that in liberal, pluralistic university campuses where diversity is, a very common buzzword, where we're very focused on diversity, where diverse identities are almost commodified, that we assume that this might not be the case so much. But what I found is that it continues to be the case. But the other finding that I have is that many of these college students also feel that their Muslim community members, their parents, their families, their peers also don't really get them. So that I don't know if that's a surprise, but that is also the case. So many of these students struggle still with the Americanness of Muslim American women. So while with their non-Muslim peers, that audience sort of struggles with their Muslimness, with their within the community, many people struggle with what it means to be Muslim and American. So their Americanness continues to be contentious issues. So even as Muslim students struggle to inform their non-Muslim friends about their Muslimness, their Westernness, in intra-community networks, they continue to be confused and to wrangle over the meanings of Muslim Americanness. Now, I'm not a theologian, and I am not a religious leader, so I'm not going to give you ijtihadi conclusions over how to be properly Muslim and American today, but I am an anthropologist, so I'm going to give you my findings related to how young Muslim Americans develop ways to be Muslim American and youthful at the present time. One of my absolute favorite research respondents was somebody whom I'm going to call Intisar. These are all pseudonyms. I don't use any of their real names because of confidentiality and anonymity. Intisar was Somali American. So she had arrived in the United States as a refugee with a large family. And when she first arrived as a child, she felt like a complete outsider. At school, eventually, as she started to get comfortable, she started playing basketball. Well, it turned out she played really well, and playing basketball gave her immediate access to a cool, athletic community, mostly African American, and a persona that pushed her Muslimness and her Somaliness and her refugee status into the background. So basketball became a sort of indigenizing factor for her. It made her into sort of an American. So this is a quote from one of her interviews, one of my interviews with her. So she said, "You became like everyone else. You didn't have to be like a refugee. I could become part of this whole new community. I didn't feel like I had to say who I was, where I came from. Basketball defined me. It made everything easy. It made you feel like everyone else. I wasn't some Somali outcast. I could just play basketball and be Intisar, who plays basketball and who also happened to be Somali and Muslim, when those things would at first define me." Now I want you to stop there for a second. I don't want you to misunderstand Intisar. Intisar was deeply proud of being Muslim, deeply proud of being Somali, and she identified very, very profoundly with these identities of her. But the key factor here that she's defining is that these identities would at first define her. Right, so these, her faith, her Somali background essentially tended to drown her. She as a person, as Intisar, as an individual, as a young woman, disappeared under the presence of Islam, this worldwide historical community conceptualized by the US media and by popular culture. So what playing basketball did was it enabled her to cover her difference, her Somali origins, her refugee status, and to make them secondary. This is not because that she hid them. Everybody knew that she was Somali. Everybody knew that she was Muslim. But by playing basketball, she became American as well, and was able to render these identities secondary. Well, what happened was that when Intisar turned 15, her mother, who was fairly traditional, ordered her to start wearing hijab, and later to stop playing basketball so that she could become a more decorous Somali Muslim woman. So Intisar, at that point, later she became very, very gung-ho about the clothing issue, but at that point she complied a little resentfully. She wasn't that happy about it, but she continued to play basketball while wearing hijab. And at this point she found herself stuck between the expectations of her mother and her non-Muslim peers. And both of these sets of expectations played into each other. So she says, "Suddenly my mom comes out of nowhere. You can't just be Intisar, the normal person who plays basketball." And she says, "You have to carry yourself in a traditional way, which includes wearing hijab." So what she did, what she started doing was she started playing basketball while wearing hijab. So she says, "I got away with it for a year. It's really difficult to wear hijab. People assume certain traits that should go with hijab. And the hardest thing for me was to go along with stereotypes, like hijab and basketball. I thought it was a natural thing." She did not see any conflict between being hijabi and playing basketball. It wasn't a problem. It was seamless. It was completely seamless. But her friends thought, "Can you do this? How can you play basketball? Is this allowed?" So these very, what they saw as very American qualities of being mobile, of being active, athletic, her non-Muslim peers simply did not see them going with her identity as a Muslim woman, but not only a Muslim woman, but a visibly Muslim woman. So her non-Muslim friends, in other words, as well as her traditional mother, pressured her to perform a stereotypical Muslim woman and to conform to stereotypes about what she could or could not do as a hijabi. So while basketball had initially enabled her to find a space of comfort and belonging, she was now taken out of that athletic community, and the persona she had constructed was erased. So she said, I had to create a whole new other person. I came out of that athletic community. If I don't play basketball, there's nothing for us to talk about. And now that she was not playing basketball, she suddenly felt very bare in her identity. As a hijabi, her difference, her race, her religion once again became her primary characteristics. Now, Intisar wasn't the only person to feel this way. Many of my participants felt very uncomfortable about constantly being reduced to their faith identities. This happened very often. And because of this, Muslim undergraduates, who were very religious and very proud of their faith, sometimes actually tried to play down their religious lives when they were in public settings. Intisar did that by means of basketball. So when she goes at college, Intisar took an elective class, because you can take all kinds of electives, right? So she took an elective class for basketball. Awesome, right? So she's playing basketball, and at first, when she joins this class, her peers, her non-Muslim friends, look at her, take one look at her, and say, Somali woman, hijabi, we're not going to pick you on our team. And at first they wouldn't pick me on their team, but then, not to brag, but I was good. And so they were suddenly very surprised when they actually saw her play. They were very surprised, and there was this constant amazement that she dealt with. Oh, you're hijabi, but you play so well. Oh, you're Somali, but blah, 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 right? And then on the part of her Muslim friends as well, not only were there some people who said, oh, wow, that is so awesome that you're a Muslim woman and you play basketball. And then on the other hand, there were these friends who said, this is so inappropriate. Look at Intisar, she's playing basketball with boys, right? So she said, I got tired. So she started to keep her basketball thing undercover from both Muslims and non-Muslims. And she said, I got tired of this teaching role. I just wanted to be myself. What we find then is Intisar wilting under the scrutiny and the amazement of both her Muslim and non-Muslim peers, and increasingly tired of shattering the mold for Muslim women set by both groups. So she also became more doubtful. Was she absolutely sure? Because of this constant surveillance on Muslim women's bodies, and particularly after 9/11 during the War on Terror, she was afraid that she was serving as a bad example and for this besieged community during the War on Terror. Should she be doing this, our bodies being so visible and so constantly under scrutiny, she just stopped playing basketball altogether. She missed it a lot. She told me how she missed it a lot, and sometimes when she was by herself, she shot hoops, but she stopped playing altogether. So we Americans often like to say that you have the power to do whatever you want, to be whoever you want, and you should be whoever you want to be. And my book, what it does is examine some of the ways in which people are not free to be who they want to be, and the things they do when they are not free to be who they want to be. And some people, when I speak to university audiences, typically when people hear Intisar's stories, they want to find her and tell her, go play ball, forget about your mom. But Intisar doesn't want to forget about her mom. Mm-hmm. She doesn't want to forget about her basketball either. She wants her basketball, she wants her mom, she wants her faith, she wants her friends, but she is forced to choose. And this is what I constantly find with my research respondents. So Intisar's experience shows us that though identity options on US campuses are becoming almost cliche in their multiplicity, these options are not freely available to everyone. And here on campus, the context of my research, scholars say that other college students, that your college peers, are the single most potent source of influence on college students. We professors like to believe that we are the life-changing factors on campus. Nope. We really are very secondary to the influential factors for students, but for undergraduates, it is their peers which are the most significant source of influence. So what happens? I mean, what happens when Muslim American students, many of whom grow up within religiously observant families, how do such youth engage with the campus environment, for example, at a big party school? And when you think about party schools, I'll talk next about the structure of my book, just a very little bit. So if you look at my book chapter titles, you'll find that at the center of the book lie 3 data-driven chapters, and they center around, first of all, alcohol culture, second, sartorial culture. That's a big word for clothing, so essentially what, fashion and clothing on campus, and third, gendered and sexual behavior. Some people get quite mystified by my choice of focus. Why do I choose to focus on these things? But undergraduates are never surprised because they know what undergraduate culture is like. But for others, I'll explain that these themes didn't really start out as being essential to my research. I started out thinking more in terms of interfaith encounters on campus, but then as I did my research, Brother Adam Malik is laughing, and I realized that eventually that these were the key factors that jumped out in terms of frequency of occurrence in my data. So leisure culture or social culture is what is a powerful medium in campus social spaces. And I contend that this leisure culture constructs marginality for other ways of being, for example, Muslim ways of being. And so many of my participants felt that many of their peers associated Muslims with the usual Orientalist stereotypes, as well as a notion of Muslims being the opposite of what normal undergraduates were supposed to be like. So these stereotypes, these Orientalist stereotypes, were part of the consciousness of my Muslim respondents, because they were constantly fighting them, resisting them, correcting them, avoiding them, and at times also making use of them. Well, campus leisure culture is centered on sociability at college bars, clubs, Greek housing, and campus parties. Undergraduate campus fun is not just any fun. It is a brand marketed and promoted to students by economic and cultural forces. And religious Muslim students were asked why, when college bestowed upon them freedom from their parents and their communities, why didn't they choose to fit in? Why didn't they choose to become insiders, become normal young people, and have some crazy fun? So alcohol culture was built on an extensive web of cues and rituals. So Yasmin, one of my respondents, was a Pakistani-American sophomore and who participated in campus culture and in alcohol culture. She said, yeah, people have parties, and yes, at the party, before the party, people have posters of drinks on their walls, and they talk about how much they drink, what they drink, how good it is, how much it costs, and all of these things. So all of these kind of cues go into building campus culture. And then she went on to say, and this is, keep in mind, this is a person who fully participated in campus culture. She was fully culturally assimilated in campus culture. And she says it's pretty dumb what we do for enjoyment, but then everyone keeps telling you it's fun, and then you start believing it's fun. Oh, clubs are fun, and then you have a story to tell someone. So this story to tell, so these narratives that you have once you start participating in campus culture are important. So she says, I went to the club last night. Oh, was it really fun? Yeah, it was great. Was it really? No. People dancing, you don't even know any of them. It's dark, it's smelly, all of these things, but it's a story to tell someone. And once you are able to tell these stories, once you have these stories, you become, this reinforces your novice membership status as well as perpetuates college culture. So for novice members, alcohol was a force for sociability. It was a centering subject of conversation and experience. So in American social culture, and this is something that my advisor once mentioned to me, and he said he was aware of how sort of out of place I sometimes felt when everybody else was hanging out at the bar and I wasn't there. And he said, well, in American culture, alcohol is central to forging sociable informality. If you're not there, forging that sociable informality, you are essentially left out of those networks. And my respondents talked about how they felt vis-a-vis the camaraderie that they missed out on by virtue of not. So it's not purely a matter of am I picking up a drink or not. It's a matter of the camaraderie that you share when you are participating in a culture. So this is college, a lot of college, particularly for freshmen as well as for sophomores, is about trying to fit in and conform. That's a cat, and the other ones are, you know, meerkats. Now we all try to varying degrees to fit in wherever we are. At work, at school, at the mosque, we try to meet the dominant expectations of what is considered normal, what is considered ordinary, what is considered higher status. So people who cover stigmatized identities might attempt to displace the stigma to a lesser one. So for example, Intisar plays basketball, right? So she tries to displace the stigma of being Muslim and being Somali. I, for example, wear thick-framed glasses and sometimes wear blazers in order to displace my gender in the male-dominated academic profession. So all of these things we often do to displace stigmatized identities. Well, obviously, one of the issues this widespread stereotyping creates is in terms of our expectations of diversity in student life. Scholars of higher education believe, many scholars of higher education believe that students really ought to transcend their home communities and socialize with others who are different from them, blend in, attain diversified identities. Well, this contact hypothesis is simple enough, but in my fieldwork I find that for Muslims and other marginalized and minoritized students, the stigma of Muslim religiosity puts their identities at risk. Campus then becomes yet another space after grade school, after high school, where Muslim youth must force themselves to blend in, and yet another space where white Christian students can pick up a smattering of diversity without being significantly challenged in their identities. So what's the answer? I mean, people will ask me sometimes, so what's the answer? I don't know. The answer really depends on who you are. For some people, the answer is enclaves. And enclaves is a pocket, like it's a social space where you only interact with, socialize with people who are like yourself. Many Muslims do believe that enclaves are the answer, but this is not necessarily a strategy that can be broadly adopted by any community simply because it won't happen. So plenty of Muslim college students socialize only with Muslims and avoid mainstream social settings. And Amira contemplated this possibility. And she said she could see the advantages of such an approach. And she said it can make it easy for you to live in an insulated world where everyone you know doesn't drink. You become cushioned, you can feel secure, and you become self-confident. So there are these benefits where you're not always dealing with the stigma of how other people are perceiving you. So that is an advantage. But she says, I see a parallel between that and when I was trying to make a decision whether I should go to an all-girls college or co-education. And the argument is always the real world. If I'm working in the State Department, it's not going to be all girls. So for somebody like Amira, she saw that a Muslim who wore her religious identity on her sleeve and only interacted with other Muslims might enjoy a certain ease of how to maintain her identity. So if you were a vocal teetotaler, you might by default end up with other religious Muslims who don't drink. So you would find a space of comfort outside of majority society, and so you could access a comfort of sorts even if you were being excluded from mainstream settings. And as Amira says, there are personal and psychological advantages to keeping the company of fellow Muslims and or fellow ethnics. Personal self-confidence can result. Everyday social life can be free from the perpetual encounters with stereotypes, with symbolic violence, with stigma. And the comfort, however, of ethnic or religious enclaves is similar to what Amira talks about in terms of the comfort of girls in a single-sex school, in more ways than one. Like girls, minority community members must learn to live with the presence and the power of the majority, as girls must live with the presence and power of males in a male-dominated society. This does not mean that the encounters become innocuous with practice. Social assimilation with the majority is a pragmatic necessity and often an unwelcome one. So integration within white society is important for worldly success. It's not necessarily enjoyable or comfortable, and it is often unsafe for religious identity. So in my book, as well as in other writings, I do argue that private spaces are important, private community spaces are important, and that diversity as a focus on integration, social integration for all students, is not enough by itself as a policy. In the context of stigmatized minority, such as Muslim identities in white dominant society, cultural assimilation is generally the norm, though it has been theoretically discarded in critical scholarly circles. So I wanted to then go back to Yasmin, who even while she became very culturally assimilated, struggled with this choice that she was making, and in some ways saw it as a false choice. So she said, like, either I have to be completely assimilated, completely into this culture, or either have to become completely like Muslim and be separate instead of apart. So this choice of isolationism or separationism or sticking to enclaves as opposed to complete cultural assimilation became something that a lot of Muslim students agonized over. And that was not only if they were very religiously observant, it was also for young people who were not that religiously observant. For people like Amber, who was an MSA officer, she was a president of the MSA, she felt like, as somebody who wore hijab, that she was being cornered into having this very loud Muslim identity. And again, like Intisara, this identity took over her entire person. She said, I feel like if you're a wishy-washy type of Muslim, you'll just be walked over. I feel like I'd have to be even more loud about my identity now, as in after 9/11. She said, in class, when they're talking about it, Muslims, heads turn towards you. You're expected to speak. If you don't, then you're completely selling out. So the burden of representation on people who were seen as visibly Muslim and women who wore hijab immediately became the representatives, immediately became put in this position of being forced to represent the entire community, were seen as either constantly representing, or if they didn't, then as sellouts. So she said there were times after 9/11 when I wished I wasn't wearing hijab, because you have a responsibility to articulate it, not just what Islam is, but what Muslims hear. You should be knowledgeable about it, you should be articulate enough to talk about it. The standards are quite high, and the burden is very heavy. And many of my respondents became very, very tired. So weariness was often a theme of many of my research interviews, that they just became tired of what sociologists sometimes call overbeing, that you constantly have to perform these identities, constantly have to act like the peaceful Muslim, the friendly Muslim, the good Muslim, all of those things constantly for the benefit of the observer. So I'm going to wrap up now. I hope I didn't go on too long, because I really wanted to have some time for Q&A. But, you know, that was a few themes, and I'll be happy to address any additional questions. Yeah, please.
A topic that has interested me recently is that in Time and Harper's Magazine, there were a number of articles about what I am calling a rape culture at college.
Right.
And I have been wondering, and while I was reading that, I was wondering whether Muslim girls get raped as often because they generally would not participate in all this drug stuff. On the other hand, I think if these girls had grown up in Europe rather than in Puritan United States, they had learned to handle their alcohol much before they came to college. So I feel that those poor white girls that constantly get raped are a victim of their own Puritan culture, because the Muslim girls know how to say no, but the American girls don't know what to do, and they don't know how much they can take. They've never practiced having a little bit of alcohol and maybe a little bit more. When do they get? They don't know anything. So they are for the raping. Do you have any numbers on, is it more often that, do Muslim girls get raped? How often compared to American girls?
No, I don't have any numbers. We don't, because we don't cover religion in the census, so we don't have numbers, period. I mean, I don't do quantitative research as well, but it's a very interesting question. I wouldn't assume that any group of girls, whether Muslim or anything, I wouldn't assume that they wouldn't be victims of rape. And I actually am thinking about a respondent whom I did not include in the book, that there was that. But I didn't want to include it in the book precisely because it was much too personal, and so it does happen. I think I'm now thinking actually about our class, our Gender and Islam class, where we've been talking about clothing, for example, where many people have idealized the idea of, you know, the pure, the virginal Muslim woman who wears hijab and therefore is completely safe. I really wouldn't assume. We've been talking about how it's not a suit of armor.
I was not really asking about absolutes. I was curious if you asked 5,000 women, some of whom were Muslim, I have a suspicion that fewer Muslim girls get raped because they will say no. And if the other girls knew better how to handle their alcohol, they would also not get raped. There are so many stupid women that set themselves up for this.
I am not going to agree with you because because rape is something that the rapist does.
I am not justifying it. It is never justified.
Yeah.
But situations happen.
Sure.
Like if I go out at 3 o'clock in the night, it's more likely that someone will do something to me than if I go out at 11 in the morning. So
it's still the rapist.
They still shouldn't do it. But I was actually not even thinking of rape. I was thinking of being stuck up with a gun and my money. Whatever it is, it never is right.
Sure.
But you can create situations where those who want to do wrong find you. And you can also avoid these situations.
I don't think you
topic,
can.
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
this is a huge topic by itself.
That's right.
Very sensitive and very important.
Yeah.
But not germane to the topic at hand.
Next lecture, inshallah.
Yeah, next question.
I apologize.
No problem.
So I went to a public university, and my experience here in Chicago was that the public university, at least in Chicago, skewed more conservative. And actually, after I left, it skewed even more conservative.
Yeah.
It would have been interesting also to compare and contrast the experiences of a public versus private university, maybe in the next book.
I so agree with you. And this is actually something that was sort of a choice before me when I was in the DC area, thinking University of Maryland, College Park, George Mason, Georgetown, George Washington, but I really, really wanted to do sort of a comparative study at 2 campuses, and given the Beltway and the traffic, I really wanted to avoid the time spent in the car and wanted to maximize the time spent in the field. So that really, I mean, honestly, that was one of the key factors that forced me to choose that. But I would love to do that study and include men. I would really love to do that. And you are absolutely right in that, and a lot of Georgetown students prided themselves on the fact that they saw their own culture, the private Bohemian Georgetown Muslim culture, as more inclusive than many other cultures and many other public university MSAs. So for instance, at this time, when all this was happening, the University of Maryland College Park had developed a separate MSA for women, because they wouldn't even necessarily do things together. So it's interesting how things happen. Social class, I think, is a big factor in this, in the way campus cultures develop. Thank you. Amen.
Any other questions?
Do you want me to mic? All right. Assalamualaikum.
Thanks.
And I had a question regarding where did your respondents replenish their identity wariness? Did they have any sort of external support groups off campus that they resorted to?
So the MSA was very often what people call a site of resistance, a place where you kind of gather solidarity and are able to, as you say, replenish
Their wariness,
their
identity
their weariness. Yeah. So the MSAs were, but they weren't perfect. Right, because MSAs, as we know, are not perfect. They are formed of humans as well. It depended on who they were, and in the case of many of them, there have been dramatic shifts in identity, where, for example, a young woman who was extremely religious went very the other direction, and vice versa. So there are consequences to these identity pressures. But I think that they were able to find resources within themselves, as well as within their local communities, and not only their religious communities, but others as well. So other women and people who, for example, in scholarly circles and intellectual sort of, how should I put, intellectual companions. So, but it's hard. How would you do it? How would you replenish identity weariness? Yeah.
Well, I guess in my undergrad, I was tied often to my local masjid, and I grew up in a rural island community, and so from a young age, my family basically had us volunteering and running around programs for our other members.
Right.
So that's why this
Yeah.
oil and water that I'm sort of hearing with American and Islamic identity clashes, that's not something that I particularly experienced. But I wanted to follow up with my question regarding what sort of correlation, or if any, did your respondents have with their families? Did they have a strong family culture that helped sort of mediate an Islamic and American identity, or were they kind of pulling apart at the seams?
Most of them were pretty happy in their families. Most of them have had parents who were fairly understanding. There's always the intergenerational kind of gap of understanding. In most cases, it was there. But I want to go back to what you said about the oil and water. I don't want you to take the impression that that was the case with these respondents. But it's complicated. I mean, and I'm finding it very difficult to kind of encapsulate a very complex issue in a very short answer. I think that in some cases, the conflict arose from perceptions of how they were seen. But in some cases, it arose from just the available categories that they found, the available boxes that they were constantly being boxed into particular categories. Where, for example, Intisar doesn't see any conflict between, for example, basketball and hijab. She doesn't see a conflict, but the conflict is pushed into her life. So that's where I think the conflict is coming from.
Thank you.
Yeah. Nermi?
Thank you for this talk. I wanted to ask you about race, both what you observed on these campuses in terms of race among them within the MSAs.
Yeah.
So first part, sort of what you observed, and then was race a part of your conversations with your interlocutors, and what were the sorts of things that you were hearing from them, and then just sort of how does race play out in your
I'm
book?
so glad you brought that up. Like just like a fellow anthropologist to bring up the important issues, absolutely. Race was an extremely important part of my conversations. I was having a lot of trouble finding respondents who were not, South Asian or or Arab, right? It was quite hard to find them, and I actually raised this issue with my respondent, whom I call Elizabeth, and she's black, and she was a convert, and she had converted fairly recently at campus, and I asked her. I said it's been really hard finding black Muslim respondents, and she said we're kind of undercover because the MSA doesn't really speak to us, right? The MSA is very immigrant. It has a very immigrant cultural style, and she then talked in a lot of detail about the gendered style, for example, and the sort of official Islamic public practices that we often have, which don't necessarily match our private life practices. So where we try to pretend like I don't even acknowledge that there's a man in the room, that sort of practice, she found it very off-putting and strange. Now, interestingly, she actually acculturated herself to that at a later date. But she had some very, very interesting things to talk about, not only about race, but about class as well, because class became very, very deeply intertwined with these issues of being, the child of doctors at Georgetown University, having a lot of disposable income, as opposed to somebody who's there on a full scholarship and who cannot believe that people spend money like this. Right? And so, for example, I talk in the chapter on clothing, where people tell her, "Hey, you need to have a hijab you need to have modest clothing for the MSA regional convention." And the night before, she gets this email, and she says, "I don't have anything." She says, "I only have jeans, right? And I don't have these nice tailored, modest clothing outfits." And she just found that very difficult to deal with. And she says, these people don't understand how hard it is, for example, for me to get my hair into a hijab, right? And that, she's very tall. She says, I have this long inseam. How am I supposed to find a skirt? They don't make skirts that long. So all of these issues of race, of body type, of class, absolutely, they're in there. But I really want to follow that a little more. And actually, right now, I'm working on an article. Maybe we can talk about it. And that is about cultural commodification, and particularly of South Asian styles in campus diversity. So that's kind of a thread of race that I want to pick up later. We should talk. Yeah?
Oh,
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
First of all, thank you so much for an enlightening lecture, and it's really nice, and it's very close to what you have explained as my experience on campus.
Okay.
But I wanted to ask you about what percentage of women did you find, or students did you find, who were in identity crisis and were sort of in double identity, who were doing this and that? I'm just curious what percentage.
So my research is, because it's qualitative, we don't really do the statistical, yeah. What we focus on is the presentation of rich cases, and the kind of extrapolation of themes from that. But it's an interesting question. I think that it depends on how you identify a crisis, right? I think for many of them there is the weariness factor that you were talking about, that the weariness factor is there. And then in many cases, because of stigma and because we try to fit in wherever we are, there were plenty of people who lived double lives. I think I lived probably multiple lives depending on where I am, right? So for example, you go to the masjid, you don't behave like you do when you're at, at work or something. You behave in slightly different ways. Of course, depending on what your masjid is like. but all of us, I think, tend to conform and adapt to.
Well, I was actually speaking in terms of extremes. An
I didn't see
example
extremes.
No, okay.
Yeah.
Like, I was very comfortable because, you can say we are fortunate that, all schools and institutions, they do have MSAs and PSAs, all these student bodies, there's
Sure.
plenty of
Yeah.
friends,
Yeah.
you fit in, and why try to make
Yeah.
ways? I mean, that
Yeah.
was my experience.
Sure.
Was
Sure.
that I was very involved and I was very active and I was very comfortable with the surrounding. But you're saying those cases who would fall into identity crisis and go really extremes are not, you didn't find a significant.
I'm having trouble identifying what you mean by crisis.
Well, what I meant was people living double identities. When we go to work, I don't change my identity. I'm still a Muslim woman.
Sure.
I don't change, flip.
Sure.
I don't.
Sure.
I am who I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether I'm at school or I'm at work.
Sure.
So I wouldn't go attend happy hour.
Right.
And
I
I go to
guess that's what
masjid
you're
and
saying.
become a Muslim.
Okay.
I am who I am.
Okay. Well, what I'm actually talking about in the book is that in many of these cases, these young women don't see it as a conflict to be attending happy hour and then to be at Jummah.
Oh, okay.
In some of the cases, they don't see it as a conflict. It's just they're Muslim so they're at Jummah, and they're there for fellowship, and they're also there at the club. So it's I'm not at the bar, obviously, and you're not. But for many people who are raised that way and who are much more comfortable,
They don't see a conflict.
they don't really see a conflict. No.
I find that amazing.
Yeah.
Me too.
You should go about selecting a campus that you were going to cover in your book.
Right.
Was it based on appearance? Was it through the MSA? Or did you get a list of university enrollments and students who wish to disclose they were Muslim?
Right. This is soon after 9/11. Everybody's on edge. Nobody wants to talk to a researcher. The FBI is involved in all kinds of surveillance activities. So it was not easy to get people to talk to me. Because people are going like, who are you? Are you passing on the information to the government? I'm just like, it was not easy. So the first thing I did was I went through the MSA, just as, the local gatekeeper, as a sign of respect for, that's sort of the kind of a protective organization for the community. So I went through them, and I attended the meetings there and had people sign up. But what I found then was that a lot of my respondents ended up, after a few weeks, I'm looking at my respondents and they're all, they all pray, they're all living at the Muslim housing center, they're all at Jummah, and I'm going, oh, well, okay, this is really nice, but I'm missing a really, really big population out there. So at that time, your email directories were public. I don't think they are anymore. But at that time they were public. So guess what I did? I started putting in names like Khan and Hassan and Hussein, things like that into the email directory, and pulling up names of people who had nothing to do with the MSA. And just emailing them saying, hey, are you interested in some research? I'm looking at identity issues. And then I found people that really represented a much wider diversity of people that, you and I might not otherwise socially encounter.
And how big of a group? How many students?
So total there were 26. the primary respondents. This is not including all the people that I did participant observation with, but yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for a great presentation. It was about time men get to talk about American Muslim women.
I think you guys get to talk all the time.
And thanks for corroborating my
Please
feedback.
continue.
Thanks for corroborating my feedback that I filled out before I even heard you. I have a loaded question, which is not germane to the data that you observed and collected, but might be relevant to the research that you did, and would like to know your experience of what you saw, what you observed, or didn't observe. There are certain perceptions about MSA or within the MSA culture, and it's not monolithic. MSA at DePaul is not the same as MSA somewhere
Right.
else, or even at DePaul it's not the same that it was 25 years ago.
Right, absolutely.
There's this perception, real or perceived, that women who do not cover, Muslim women who do not cover their head, they are thought much less of a Muslim, not as a Muslim for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Muslim guys, time and time again I've seen they would think of them as fair game, so to speak. And what's ironic is that when they're looking to get married, they would go for a hijabi woman. But before that, no, it's the non-hijabis that they're after. And stuck in between are those who do cover their head, but they don't wear hijab per se, they wear dupatta, which is not in the discourse about modesty at all. So your thoughts or observations?
That's a really long response. Okay, I'm going to refer you to what, chapter 4? But
A whole chapter.
okay, so funny thing you mentioned that, but okay, so I heard complaints on both sides, men and women, and I heard complaints from the women, and that was, why can't they talk naturally? Why do they act like we're after them or something? Why can't they just relax and give it a rest? And on the part of the men, what is wrong with the hijabis? Why don't they talk to us? Why don't they just relax, right? And so there was this kind of, and not all of them. I'm not talking about all of them, on the part of some. And on the other hand, this kind of criticism of some of their members, oh, those Muslims are so comfortable with the opposite sex. Why are those Muslim guys and girls hanging out? Why are they friends with each other? This is not appropriate, right? So what I'm finding is, and like I said, I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to tell you what people should be doing. I think that depends on who you are. I'm just telling you that there is quite a wide diversity of practice out there. And I think that there are men who are actually actively avoiding the hijabis for marriage. Yeah. So there's all kinds. And I'd say if he's that superficial, then he can.
The gist of my question was, did you observe a certain bias against those Muslim women who may be practicing Muslim women,
right.
but they do not cover their head? To them, modesty is not more than a piece of cloth on their head.
Yeah. So I did encounter that, and I encountered the opposite as well.
Okay.
Right? Because keep in mind, this research I did it at a fairly liberal MSA, right? So you have both biases playing. So on the one hand, you have, oh, those hijabis, they're so judgmental, they're just always looking at us and going, why are we dressed like this? And on the other hand, my goodness, whenever I come to Georgetown, I feel like I'm just way too conservative because everybody looks down on me for the way I am. So there's both. Absolutely, there's both.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.